My name is Lauren Graves. I am an emergency medicine attending physician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, and on the morning of my wedding, I received exactly 47 RSVPs from my guests. Not one of them shared my last name. The ceremony was held at a small chapel in Lincoln Park on a Saturday in October, the kind of morning where the air tastes like wood smoke and the trees along the street have gone the color of copper pennies. I had reserved the first 2 rows on the bride's side for my family: my father, my mother, my older brother Ethan, his wife, and their 2 kids. I had sent their invitations 4 months early. I had called. I had left voicemails that I rehearsed the way I once rehearsed anatomy before boards. They didn't come. My father had made his position clear the previous spring, standing in the kitchen of the house where I grew up, arms crossed, face arranged into the expression he used when closing deals he considered beneath him. "Marcus is a carpenter, Lauren. He makes furniture. I didn't pay for medical school so you could settle." Those were the exact words. I remembered them the way I remembered the first time I lost a patient. You don't forget the sentence. You just learn to breathe around it. Marcus Webb builds custom furniture in a workshop behind our house in Andersonville. His hands are always slightly rough, and he laughs too loudly at his own jokes, and he has never once in 4 years made me feel small. He brought coffee to the chapel that morning without being asked, and handed me a cup outside the vestibule doors. "You ready?" he said. I told him I had been ready since the day I met him. He smiled the way he does when he's trying not to get emotional, and walked ahead to find his place at the altar. I walked in alone. The organist played. The guests stood and turned. I kept my chin level and my eyes forward the way I do when I'm walking into a trauma bay, and I need everyone in the room to believe I am not afraid. It was the longest 30 feet of my life. When I reached Marcus, he took both my hands and leaned close and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "They don't deserve to be here anyway." I almost laughed. Instead, I held on. The vows were simple. The officiant was a colleague from the hospital, a cardiologist named Dr. Tone. Osei, who had known me since internship and cried twice during the ceremony without apology. Afterward, Marcus's mother found me near the reception entrance and pressed both my cheeks between her palms and said, "Welcome home, baby." I excused myself to the coat room and stood there for 2 minutes in the dark and let myself cry exactly once before going back out. That night, Marcus and I sat on the balcony of our hotel room. The city was loud below us, cabs and music and the distant sound of a train. I had been checking my phone since the ceremony ended. He saw me do it and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Put it away, Lauren." Whatever they were going to say, they already said it by not coming. I put the phone face down on the table, but I didn't sleep. The weeks after the wedding were quiet in the way that feels like the moment before a storm rather than the moment after one. I threw myself into work. November in the ER is its own kind of war. Flu season stacking on top of the usual trauma, the hallways loud and cold and never fully staffed. I liked it that way. When you are managing 6 patients at once, your father's silence becomes background noise. Marcus was steady. He finished a commission for a family in Evanston, a dining table in white oak, and brought home photographs of it on his phone like a proud parent. We cooked together on my days off. We argued about whether the thermostat in the bedroom was set too high. Normal things. Good things. I was learning that ordinary life, the kind without drama and ultimatums, felt almost foreign after 31 years of trying to earn my family's approval. Then came the text. It was a Tuesday just after 7 in the morning. I was between patients, standing at the nurse's station with half a cup of lukewarm coffee, when my phone buzzed. My father's name appeared for the first time in 3 months. The message read, "Ethan's restaurant is failing. He needs $14,000 to cover back rent and payroll. You're the only one in a financial position to help. This is family." I read it 3 times. Ethan had opened a gastropub in Naperville 18 months earlier. My father had publicly called it his greatest investment and my brother's greatest achievement. They had not invited me to the opening. I had heard about it from my cousin. The restaurant had been struggling for almost a year, according to the same cousin, because Ethan had hired his college friends to manage the kitchen and kept changing the menu concept and had, at some point, taken a personal draw from the business account that his accountant was still trying to reconcile. I set the phone down on the nurse's station and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up, opened my banking app, and transferred exactly $1 to my father's account. In the memo line, I typed, "Best of luck to Ethan." Then I blocked the number and went back to my patients. My charge nurse, a woman named Gloria who has seen everything and has opinions about all of it, watched me do this from across the counter. She raised both eyebrows. "Family drama?" she said. I told her to mind her monitors. But that evening I told Marcus. He was sanding the legs of a new commission, a rocking chair in cherry wood, and he stopped and set the sandpaper down and listened without saying anything until I was finished. Then he said, $1. I nodded. He picked up the sandpaper again. "Good," he said. "That's exactly the right amount." I had expected relief. What I felt instead was a low, humming dread, the kind that tells you even before the call comes that something is not finished. My father was not a man who accepted the final word from anyone else. 2 weeks later, a colleague stopped me in the hallway outside the attending lounge. "Dr. Tending." Patel, an internist a few years ahead of me, looked uncomfortable in the way people do when they've been asked to deliver bad news they didn't volunteer for. "Someone called the department chair's office," he said, without looking at me directly. "Asked about your clinical standing. Said there were concerns about your judgment." I felt the floor shift slightly under me. "Who called?" He shook his head, didn't leave a name. "But the chair knows it's nothing. She just wanted you to be aware." I walked to the stairwell and stood there alone for 60 seconds. I counted them. It was something I learned in residency, when you need to feel something and you can't afford to fall apart in front of anyone. Then I walked back to the floor and finished my shift. At home, I told Marcus. He put down his coffee and looked at me carefully. "You think it was your father?" I told him I didn't have to think very hard. He nodded slowly. "What are you gonna do?" he asked. I told him I was going to do nothing because my record was clean and my department chair was not a fool, and my father had, once again, aimed at someone who knew how to take a hit and keep moving. But nothing is exactly what I did, and nothing is the hardest thing to maintain when someone keeps coming toward you. The call came into the hospital's main line 3 days later, during a shift change. The charge supervisor at the front desk flagged me down in the main corridor. "There's a man at the entrance asking for you," she said. "He says he's your father." I found him near the security desk in the main lobby. Richard Graves. 62 years old, silver at the temples, wearing a coat that cost more than Marcus made in a good month. He was speaking to the security guard in the tone he used with wait staff and junior employees. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Carl who had worked that desk for 11 years, looked over my father's shoulder when he saw me approaching and gave me the practiced look of someone who has already assessed the situation and found it manageable. "Dad." My voice came out even, which surprised me. He turned. He looked at me the way people look at someone they are disappointed in, but still feel entitled to instruct. "There's a problem we need to discuss," he said. "Right now?" I said, "We can speak quietly in the family waiting room down the hall, or I can ask Carl to help you find the exit. Those are the options." He followed me to the waiting room. He did not sit. He told me that my dollar transfer was an act of humiliation designed to embarrass him in front of my brother. He told me that Ethan was going to lose everything because of my selfishness. He told me that Marcus had made me hard and disrespectful, that I had changed into someone he didn't recognize, that the daughter he raised had more sense than this. He said it all with the controlled volume of a man who has learned that a low voice is more frightening than a loud one. I let him finish. Then I said, "You didn't come to my wedding. You didn't call. You texted me after 3 months of silence to ask for $14,000. And now you're here, in my hospital, on my floor, trying to tell me about respect." He opened his mouth. I kept talking. "You don't get to use this building to pressure me. You don't get to call my department chair. You don't get to show up here and call it family. I am at work. I have patience. I am asking you to leave." His face went through several expressions in quick succession. I recognized the last one. It was the same expression he'd had the morning he found out I'd accepted my residency match at Northwestern instead of the program in Dallas that he had, without asking me, decided would be better for my career because it was closer to his business contacts there. It was the expression of a man who has just realized that the person in front of him is no longer listening for his approval. Carl appeared in the doorway. I had not called him, but he had followed. Because Carl has been reading rooms his entire adult life. Your father was just leaving, I said, and it was not a question. Carl nodded, and my father straightened his coat and looked at me once more and said, "You'll regret how you've treated this family." I said, "I'll take that risk." He left. I stood in the waiting room for a moment after. Through the small window, I could see the gray November sky over Lakeshore Drive. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that and filed it somewhere useful. The next few weeks were strange and quiet. My father did not contact me again, neither did my mother, though I had been receiving occasional text messages from her that hovered between apology and accusation without ever committing to either. Ethan's restaurant closed. My cousin sent me a link to the local news article as if I might not have heard. I read it once and put my phone down and made dinner. Marcus knew something was still unsettled in me even when I didn't say so. One evening after I'd been quieter than usual, he sat across the kitchen table and said, "It's okay to feel sad about it, Lauren." I told him I didn't feel sad. I felt tired. He said, "Sometimes, those are the same thing." I started running again in the mornings, something I had given up during the worst months of residency and never fully reclaimed. The lakefront in early winter is bleak and beautiful. The water iron gray, the path mostly empty except for the serious runners and the people walking dogs bundled in coats that reach the ground. I ran and thought about almost nothing, which was the point. In December, my department chair called me into her office. Dr. Reffens. Simone Wakefield had built the ER program at Northwestern from a mid-tier unit into one of the best in the Midwest. And she had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has made enough hard decisions that the smaller ones no longer require much effort. She told me the inquiry into my clinical conduct had been reviewed and closed without finding. She told me she was sorry I was dealing with something difficult outside the hospital. She told me that if it touched the hospital again, she'd handle it firmly, but that she was glad I had handled it the way I did. "You stood your ground without making it a spectacle," she said. "That matters here." I thanked her and left, and walked back to the floor and thought about my father, who had meant to wound me with that call and had instead taught my department chair something good about my character. Christmas came and went. Marcus and I drove to his parents' home in Rockford. His mother made sweet potato pie, and his father fell asleep in the armchair during a football game that no one was really watching, and his teenage nephew taught me a card game that I lost badly and repeatedly. It was easy, the way Marcus's family was always easy, and I kept catching myself feeling vaguely guilty for how much I enjoyed it. On the drive back, sleet ticking against the windshield, I said, "I think I've been grieving." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "For how long?" he asked. I thought about it. I said, "I think since before the wedding. I think I'd been grieving them for years and I kept calling it something else." He reached over and put his hand briefly over mine. He said, "Grief means you love them. That's not a weakness." I watched the highway lights blur through the wet glass and didn't answer because I didn't have words that were adequate, and Marcus had learned by then not to need them from me. January brought a new wave of respiratory cases and 2 major traumas in the same week, and I existed mostly inside my shifts. Focused, effective, useful, medicine is the one place where I have always known exactly what I am for. Then my phone rang on a Thursday morning while I was in the locker room pulling on my coat to leave after a night shift. Unknown number. Chicago area code. I answered it. It was a hospitalist physician at Rush University Medical Center. Professional and careful in the way doctors are when they are calling someone they don't know about, someone they do know. She said she was calling on behalf of a patient who had asked for me. His name was Richard Graves. He had been admitted the night before following a hypertensive emergency that had progressed to a mild cardiac event. He was stable. He had asked the nursing staff to call me that morning. I sat down on the bench in the locker room. The drive to Rush took 20 minutes. I sat in the parking garage for 5 minutes before going in, hands on the wheel, the engine still running. I thought about everything that would have been easier. I thought about what it meant that he had asked for me and not for anyone else. Then I went inside. My mother was in the hallway outside his room, standing with a paper coffee cup that she was holding with both hands. She had aged in the months since I had last seen her. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the way that grief and stress compress time on a face. She looked up when she saw me and her expression did something complicated, relief and shame moving through it in the same moment. "Lauren." "Hi, Mom." She reached out and touched my arm. She didn't hug me, and I understood that too. There was too much space between us to collapse it in a hallway. She told me he was awake, that the doctors were optimistic, that she was glad I came. I nodded and went in. My father was smaller in a hospital bed. That is the first thing you notice, as a physician and as a daughter. The machinery, the gown, the IV line in the back of his hand, the monitor tracing his rhythm in green light. He looked at me when I entered, and didn't say anything right away. I pulled the chair close and sat and looked at the monitor because reading a rhythm is always easier than reading a face. "I didn't expect you to come," he said finally. I told him I almost didn't. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's fair," he said. We sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that is not comfortable, but is at least honest. Outside the window, Chicago was gray and cold and indifferent. He said, I was too hard on Marcus. I told him he had been too hard on me. He looked at the ceiling. "I know," he said. He paused. "I've never known what to do with you, Lauren. You never needed me to fix things. You just fixed them yourself. I didn't know where to stand. I had not expected that. I had prepared for defensiveness. I had not prepared for the specific exhaustion in his voice, the particular way a proud man sounds when the armor has gotten too heavy to wear. I told him that I had needed him to show up, not to fix anything, just to be there. At the wedding, at my graduation, at the recital when I was 12 that he had missed for a client dinner. Just to be in the room. His jaw tightened the way it does before he refuses to cry. "You were always the one I didn't have to worry about," he said. "That was my mistake. I thought it meant you didn't need anything." I said, "Strong people still need someone to show up for them. That's not weakness, that's just being human." He nodded slowly. The monitor beeped its steady, patient rhythm. I stayed for 2 hours. We didn't solve anything, not really. There was no dramatic exchange, no tearful embrace, no speech that undid 30 years in 10 minutes. But somewhere in that time, something shifted. The way weight shifts when you finally set down something you've been carrying too long. I called his attending before I left and reviewed his chart and asked the questions I would want someone to ask for my own patient. When I said goodbye, he looked at me and said, "Tell your husband I'm sorry for what I said about him." I told him to tell Marcus himself, someday when he was ready. My mother walked me to the elevator. She said she had been wrong to stay silent for so long. She said it in the careful way she says difficult things, like she's testing whether the floor will hold. I told her I knew. I told her I wasn't ready to pretend nothing had happened, but that I was willing to try. The elevator doors opened. She said, "Please don't disappear again." I told her I wouldn't be the one disappearing this time. The months that followed were not simple. Healing doesn't run on a schedule that respects anyone's emotional readiness. My mother began calling on Sunday evenings, short calls at first, mostly about logistics, my father's recovery, a plumbing issue at the house, a neighbor who had moved. Slowly the calls grew longer and found their way into things that mattered. She told me once, unexpectedly, in the middle of a conversation about a recipe, that she had always thought I was the bravest person she had ever known, and that she had spent years being frightened of saying so because she thought it might make my father feel diminished. I was sitting in the kitchen when she said it, and I looked out the window at Marcus's workshop where the light was on, and the sound of a hand plane moving across wood floated in from outside. and I let myself receive it, without armor, without deflection. Just receive it. My father came to our house in April. He and Marcus sat in the backyard for an hour while I was on a phone call, and I watched them from the kitchen window without being able to hear what they were saying. Marcus was showing him the frame of a new commission, a bed in walnut, and my father was examining the joinery the way he examines construction materials. When I came outside, my father shook Marcus's hand and said, "You do good work." Marcus said, "Thank you, sir." It was enough. It was, given everything, a great deal. There is a first-year resident in my program now, a young woman from Birmingham named Dr. Camille Torres, who reminds me of myself in ways that are uncomfortable and clarifying. She is brilliant and relentless and arrived in Chicago from a family that had collectively decided her choosing medicine over law school was a personal insult. She works too many voluntary extra hours and flinches slightly when her phone rings on her off days. I recognize the posture. I used to carry it myself. One evening after a difficult shift, I found her sitting alone in the residence room, still in her scrubs, staring at nothing with the particular blankness of someone who has been holding too much together for too long. I sat down across from her. I didn't ask what was wrong. I just said, "Whoever told you that you have to earn your place here was wrong. You already have a place. You got here." She looked at me for a moment and then looked away quickly, which is what you do when someone says a thing you've been waiting to hear. I didn't tell her it would be easy. I didn't promise that the people who should be proud of her would get there before she ran out of patience. I told her that someday she might have to be the person she needed, that it would cost something, and that it would also, eventually, be enough. On the night before my father's first cardiology follow-up, he called me. He called himself, not through my mother, just dialed my number and waited. When I answered, he said, "I wanted to ask if you'd come with us. I want you to hear what the doctor says." I told him I would be there. When we arrived at the clinic, the cardiologist greeted us at the exam room door and looked at me and said, "Oh, you're the doctor. Your dad talks about you." I turned to my father. He was looking at the floor with the expression he uses to avoid showing something. "What does he say?" I asked. The doctor smiled. "He says his daughter works at Northwestern. Says she's one of the best there." My father looked up then, briefly, and met my eyes. And in the space between us I saw both the apology he still didn't know how to say and the pride he'd apparently been telling strangers about for longer than he'd been willing to tell me. I thought about the girl who had practiced her acceptance speech for medical school in the car, because she knew he would hear it on the radio before she could tell him herself. I thought about all the evenings I had stayed at the hospital 45 minutes longer than necessary, because going home meant walking into a silence that felt like judgment. And then I thought about Marcus, who had built me a bookcase for a bedroom without being asked. Every shelf level, every joint fitted cleanly, a structure designed for permanence. I thought about what it felt like to live inside a life that was chosen rather than endured. I put my hand briefly on my father's shoulder and said, "Let's hear what the doctor has to say." He exhaled. Just slightly. Just enough. We sat down together. There is a thing about emergency medicine that I sometimes explain to the residents who rotate through my department. The chaos of a trauma bay is not actually chaos. It looks that way to the untrained eye. But every role is defined, every voice has a function, every voice has a function, every action is purposeful even when it is fast. What looks like panic from the outside is, from the inside, a system built on trust. You trust the person beside you to do their part. You do yours. The patient survives because no single person had to carry it alone. I used to think strength meant carrying it alone. I was very wrong about that, and it took longer than it should have to understand. Marcus and I celebrated our first anniversary quietly. We drove up to Wisconsin for a weekend, a small town on Lake Geneva, a rental cabin with bad insulation and a wood stove he had to coax back to life with kindling and patience. We cooked badly in the small kitchen and walked along the frozen lake in the morning and sat on the porch in the afternoon under every blanket in the house. The world was white and still and very far away. On the last evening, he asked me what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about how long I had spent trying to be good enough for people who were never going to use those words about me, and how strange and quiet it felt to have finally stopped. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Do you think they knew what they were missing?" I looked at the lake, gray and smooth and enormous. "I think my father did," I said. Eventually. He just didn't know how to say it, and I stopped waiting for him to. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. "That sounds like peace," he said. I told him it felt like it too. Not the peace of having nothing left to lose. The peace of having exactly what you need and knowing the difference. The fire had burned low inside. Above the lake, the stars were sharp and cold. In the morning, we would drive back to Chicago, back to the hospital and the workshop and the ordinary, good, chosen life we had built together, shelf by shelf, joint by joint, level and true. I leaned my head against his shoulder. We stayed there until the cold finally pushed us inside,